Parker was one of the best product visionaries I've ever had the privilege of working with. He understood the customer like no one could. I think one of the most impactful things you can do is to join companies where there's high talent density, and I think it's probably the single biggest predictor of career acceleration.
Ready to go? Janie, I am so excited for this. I heard so many good things from many different people before, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course, and thanks for having me here. I think feeling is mutual. Some of my favorite people have been on the show, and I think have learned so much, and so excited to just get into it today.
Honestly, I think it's a joke that this is even my job, but no one's caught me yet. I want to start, though, on the love of product. How did you fall in love with product, and when did you realize that actually this was the thing you really wanted to devote your career to?
I think taking a way step back, I know you're not asking for my life story, but growing up, I think I just had a lot of the innate qualities of a PM. I think on one end, I was just like a weird kid growing up that loved leadership. I was the type of middle schooler or high schooler who went to leadership camp. I actually worked on a statewide nonprofit trying to lead teams of teenagers. And I think if you can lead a group of hormonal teenagers, you're on a pretty good track for the real world. I was also a humanities and very much a multidisciplinary background person. I studied public policy, African American studies. And so I think everything I did in college was writing and clarity to thought. I might have taken maybe 2 multiple choice exams, but I was pretty much writing straight every day. And I think just generally a really curious person. And so when I got into the real world, I was really fortunate to jump into a rotational program at Box, and my last rotation was on product. And I was like, oh my God, I can do all of these things without sacrificing on any one of them. And knew immediately that this was like the kind of dynamic job that I wanted.
I mean, listen, there's many elements that I want to unpick kind of later on, especially the element of writing. I do want to just ask, you've worked at some incredible places kind of throughout your years now, and some of them include obviously Opendoor and Rippling. And I was told specifically by some people to focus on Opendoor. And first, what was your biggest lessons on pricing from Opendoor?
I'd call out 2 things. I think first is I really learned how to be a GM and a business owner. I think being a PM at a low margin business is one of the best things you can do to grow your business acumen. And I've since then have only worked at SaaS companies, but in the world of pricing, accuracy and all the details mattered so much. One mispriced home could wipe out the profit of 20 or 40 homes. And so just the act of needing to be right and margins playing such a huge factor really caused me to get into every component of understanding the profitability of a home. And with our pricing algorithms, we had to understand things like outliers. And that required us to go deep and do case studies on every time we got it wrong. And on the flip side, celebrate when we shipped wins to our pricing algorithms that saved a few basis points. I think I rarely have said the term basis points in a SaaS setting. And I think this attention to detail, knowing the full P&L of a business is the type of business acumen that I think serves me especially well in SaaS settings, knowing the inputs and outputs. I think the other one is just learning in building products, how to combine automation with human touch. I think when you're building ML or AI products, you always go with the mindset of everything needs to be automated or like this needs to scale. And in shipping a lot of these pricing algorithms, you actually realize like, hey, we're directionally there, but if it's fully automated today, it's going to be a really bad experience, either for the customer because we haven't nailed it yet, or for the business because we're going to ship an algorithm that misprices a small set of homes. And so I think really figuring out like, where is the automation today, being really, really clear on where it's bad. And I think figuring out like, where do you involve manual processes, whether it's like human operators or in like a product experience today. Like you don't need AI in everything, right? It's starting to build that over time. And I think if you choose the right problems and the core things to solve first versus second versus third. You can still get there, but I think just that mindset of build your way to full automation has been hugely beneficial, not just in getting to really good algorithms, but even in how Loom ships AI product today.
My God, I love software businesses.
You'll note that that was the only company that I did this in, and have joined software businesses since.
Very, very smart transition. The other element that what I had to ask about was actually your lessons on talent bars from your time at Opendoor.
I think it's all about talent density and how you think about it when you're junior versus senior. I think when you're more junior in your career, and that's where I was when I joined Opendoor, I think one of the most impactful things you can do is to join companies where there's high talent density. And I think it's probably the single biggest predictor of career acceleration. I think when I interviewed, I remember feeling like the dumbest person in the room every interview. And I think more importantly, when I asked people why they were at Opendoor, everyone said they followed the smartest people they knew there. And for me, that was just so high signal. And I think as you get more senior, it's actually your job to create talent density when you join a startup. I think there are components of, can you coach people to get from good to great? Can you actually hire people? I think nothing raises the bar more than bringing in like really, really, really great operators. And I think the last one that's hard that we don't like to talk about is also parting ways with folks when the coaching or the feedback doesn't work in a like really transparent but also empathetic way. And I think that's the biggest mindset shift that you need to have as you kind of progress through your career. Is like at the beginning, I was just always looking for talent dense teams, and at some point you realize, oh, I need to create them. And my expectation should not be that talent dense teams exist at a company, else they probably wouldn't be hiring me or looking for a new leader. And I think that's something that I saw kind of on both ends at Opendoor.
What about Rippling? Rippling is a beast of a business today. How did that impact your mindset?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. One is Parker was one of the best product visionaries I've ever had the privilege of working with. And I think
why was he so good?
A few things. One is he understood the customer like no one could. And you have the CEO of a company actually being our HR administrator at all stages of the company growth. And you have the CEO literally assigning onboarding tasks to new employees or administering hardware. And I think he develops customer empathy in a way that is kind of unmatched across most folks I've worked with. And I think when you become the expert on the customer problem and you become a customer yourself, you have really, really clear sense of like, what are the critical problems that we just have to solve, and have really opinionated points of views on the solution. And you're probably right way more often than the average product person. And so your hit rate is also higher because you know the problem space so well. I think the other thing I'd call out is Parker was a great storyteller and salesperson. We always talk about the concept of selling ahead, selling the vision, especially as products companies are more nascent in their maturity. And whether you talked to Parker in 2016 or now, he's probably selling the exact same vision of the world. And in 2016, obviously, vision versus reality was much farther apart, but the way in which he could sell a version of the world you didn't know existed today is also kind of matched by none. And I think when you can combine the getting the problems and solutions right so often, great storytelling, and also having, I think, a real competitive moat of taking a somewhat contrarian point of view on do it all versus focus, I think you create a really unique opportunity, and the opportunity was theirs to capture, and I think they're doing a pretty good job of it so far.
What were your product lessons from Rippling?
I think two things. One is, how do you create a really, really great customer experience by being integrated everywhere? And I think the second is where and how does end user experience come into play when you're building so quickly and so many products at the same time.
Where did that lead you in terms of the end user experience when you're building so much so fast?
I think it's a very, very iterative cycle. I think when you're selling, and this is the kind of the same across so many enterprise products, right? You're selling to a buyer who may not be the user, and you're selling products that people don't really get to play with or actually use until it's purchased. And so I think it's really creating a clear point of view on what's the minimum level of usability that you need to get the purchasing decision. And then that only gets you partway through the door. If the actual users, the admins, aren't using the product, you're going to be in trouble, maybe not now, but a year from now, when people aren't able to actually administer core critical roles. And so I think making sure that you have a point of view on what gets you sold versus what gets used is probably an enterprise software wide lesson, but I think you need to do both, even if you separate out the time at which you do the two things. But I don't think you can retain customers without doing both.
In terms of having an opinion, I'm so glad you said that, because I'd love for you to have an opinion on a question on art versus science. And we're not allowed to be in the middle, Janie, okay? So we have to have an opinion, which is very important, apparently. So is product more art or science? And if you were to assign numbers to it, which gives you a little bit of leeway, where would you put it?
I know I'm cheating. Probably 60-40, more art than science. I think there is an art in diagnosis and science in how to execute. And I think the art of being a product person is, can you identify what scenario you're in? And then can you then figure out what tool in your toolkit that you want to use to solve the scenario? And I think the science aspect of pulling on your toolkit is interesting, because early in your career, you don't have a ton of tools in your toolkit. Most PMs are typically really great at one thing, something like execution, or something like writing a doc. And I think people expand their toolkit over time, and mostly by just getting the reps in of building and being in different circumstances. But I think that the ability to diagnose what situation am I in and what do I need to do to solve it is art, because I think there's just so much nuance and context that there isn't going to be a straightforward formula or framework for every single situation you find yourself in. I think when there's dysfunction on your team, you might need a great strategy because the team has no North Star. You might not need a great strategy. The team might be in such a bad place that you just need some quick wins for whatever it is just to get velocity. And so I think because of all of the different permutations of context in any given situation, I think being right is somewhat of an art to figure out what is the thing needed in this situation. I will also say amongst the toolkit, product sense is the tool or the skill that feels most art-like, but I feel there are tons of tactics for developing product intuition and taste.
What are those tactics for developing product intuition and taste? As someone who's frequently told I have little taste.
Yeah, I think there are a few things throughout the product process. I think when folks are crafting the strategy or just understanding a product, I think it's asking yourself, can I crisply articulate the customer problem and why this has to be solved? And you can ask a ton of PMs. You don't always get a great answer. And so I think that's number one, is just being so clear on the why. And I think the other bit is being able to articulate how you would talk about this in the market. And I think that gives you a really good foundation of why you're building something, what is the value for customers, and how do I actually sell it? And so I think that gives you the foundational framework. And then I think as we get into very, very tactical, how do you create the pixels of something that users will just absolutely love? I think there are probably a few questions I always ask. Is this as simple and intuitive for the user as possible? If it's not, why is that? How does this experience actually make me feel? And can or does this actually make sense across the global product experience? I think product leaders, product managers just hyper optimize for the thing that they own, and actually forcing people to think about everything might actually change the outcome or the outputs of their solution. And then I think the other question I like to ask is like, what is the extra 5 to 10% that like might not fall into scope, but could really make this land? And I think those are some of the questions that I like to ask as I'm, reviewing our own product, looking at others. And for PMs who are really, really trying to develop product taste on my team, it almost feels pedantic, but I literally say every time you work with your design partner, like give them at least 5 pieces of feedback. Here are some of the questions you can answer to try to get to good feedback. But I think, at some point it becomes muscle memory, but until it does, I think even starting with these helps you think very critically and specifically about things that ultimately I think develop the taste and intuition. And so that's the bit that is art, but also science-like, because I do think there's a path there.
I've got notes. Okay, so I'm taking notes. So,
I gotta send you a notebook, Harry.
No, I actually just prefer writing on my hand. It's kind of easier. So my number one is, you said there about kind of, is it as simple as it could be? Janie, is simple always better in product?
I think it depends on who you're building for, but I think generally, yes. I do really, really believe in progressive disclosure in product experiences. And so I think in a world where you know exactly who your user is, exactly what they want, can you be as hyper specific and personalized as possible? Absent that, how do you become really, really opinionated on, in a given experience, what are the first level of actions you may want to take, and only expose more if you really, really show interest in wanting to take that. But I do think, and this is a core product principle of Loom, is it just has to be simple, fast, and easy for a product to be loved and adopted. I think there are obviously nuances and edge cases where the complexity is required, but I'd say for most products, on average, the simple, easy to use ones often win.
How do you want to make users feel? You said there about it's about how you make them feel. How do you want users to feel as a product creator and as a PM?
I want them to feel like superheroes. It sounds a little bit. Ultimately, our job as product people is to make people do their daily tasks or solve their biggest problems in a way that makes them better than they were before. And so when people are using our product, I think I want them to feel like they've accomplished something, feel like they've gained a ton of value, and feel like they're better product people, employees, humans as a result of using the product. And I think you can do that, I think, both by choosing the right problems to solve, but the other bit is like how you celebrate users and customers on the product matter a ton. And sometimes you also have to make that ROI and value they're getting really, really explicit, because some people will kind of just go through the motions and know that the product is helpful, but may not realize to what extent. And so whether it is like specifically how much time you saved, or the fact that like you just actually reached way more people than you would have had you like gone with another way of communicating, I think it's also our job to make people feel those things explicitly as well as implicitly by solving the core problems well.
You said about being opinionated. I think there's one part of Loom's product which is quite opinionated, which is when you reach 25 videos, I think it's like a hard cutoff. And it's like you have to delete videos if you want to do more, or you pay more. That is quite an opinionated kind of paywall. How did you think about that? I'm just interested.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say it evolved over time, and it was highly dependent on the business needs. I think very, very early in Loom's journey, it was grow, 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 right? There is this asynchronous video is a pretty new behavior in the market. People were really used to consuming short form video. They were really used to being in Zoom meetings and live video, but the act of recording yourself, sending it to people at work was still fairly new. And so goal number one is create a new market behavior and get as many people there as quickly as possible. And then I think context also is we experienced the COVID boom where everyone suddenly had much larger appetite for adopting any new behavior really. And so in that moment, we actually didn't have those limits. We had a much higher limit that was actually never enforced. And so we really let people use our paid product kind of to no end. And then obviously COVID bust and revenue pressures came about. And so I think as that period happened, and I think as most companies did, we took a really hard look at our pricing and packaging and figured out what are the right limits to achieve the balance of goals that we need. I think in this new phase of revenue growth being kind of the number one North Star at our company, obviously needed to drive new revenue, but I think the other constraints that we placed in our pricing and packaging principles were really important. I think recognizing that, yes, we need to optimize for revenue, but also we probably have 1% market penetration of this behavior. And so we still need to really grow flywheel willingness to try recording video was really high. And so a core principle was like, don't block people from recording or viewing, like always give them an out. And so even with driving new pricing and packaging limits at a 25 limit, we made sure that everyone had an out, which is one, you could invite people to get a higher limit, or you could actually just delete videos. And is it zero friction? No, but is it still...
I delete videos. Yeah, it's pretty easy. I hate it. I look back and I go like, oh Christ, you were young. Get rid of that shit. So you absolutely can. So I totally see that. Can I ask you? You mentioned there the North Star being revenue growth. Do you think that's a good North Star? I don't mean to critique, but like I always say, your North Star should never be revenue. For me, it's about number of videos created per month per user. That to me defines the value of Loom.
It's interesting because for the longest time, our North Star was video views and that core engagement metric. And in the last, call it 1 to 2 years, where we updated for the first time our North Star metric to be revenue growth, I think it's actually, among other inputs, driven some of the highest velocity, best product, and best solving of both customer and business problems. And I think there are a few reasons. I think just being really explicit about the viability of your business, what makes you a great business, always comes back to revenue at the end of the day, especially as you're in growth stages. And so I think making that abundantly clear and explicit was really, really helpful. And everyone had to tie back. Like, even if I'm driving engagement, like it made us do the extra work of understanding, how does driving engagement actually lead to revenue in the long run? It doesn't necessarily need to lead to revenue in the next 1 to 2 months. It could refer to how we think about it in terms of long-term retention. But I think connecting the dots is something that it forced us to do. I think the second bit in product development that is potentially a mindset shift is, if you want to create products people are willing to pay for, what does that mean? It means you need to do and build something that is so critical to them and solving it so well that they're actually giving you the benefit of their dollars and their wallet. And I think, in the worst case outcome of building or optimizing for revenue growth, you're doing short-term things that are incredibly bad for your product, forgetting about core engagement, and especially for a PLG company like Loom. I think in the best case, it gives everyone a really, really clear mandate to make sure that they know exactly how they're doing. What they're doing is tying to revenue and raising the bar for the quality of products. And fortunately, that's the area I think we landed.
Okay, a couple of quick fires. Do you think you're opinionated enough if you give people the chance to delete, to invite? Like, I don't pay for Loom. I love it, but I just delete videos. Like, should you not be more opinionated?
I think we can. I think there's a world where we might get there, but I think where we're at today is we really value our power users. Power users have an outsized impact on our ecosystem, both in their reach, the number of viewers they're getting, and I think the second is no matter what you do, there are some customers who are never going to pay for your product. And I think that's okay. And so there's a question to be had of like, how large do you want that group to be? And like, what is the value of letting them continue to be on the ecosystem? And
do you even want them?
I think right now, like, Harry, I want you on our ecosystem. You, I'm hoping, are sending looms that have broad reach to customers. I think the value of you posting a loom on your Twitter feed or any of your channels actually gives us way more in top of funnel awareness than the cost of storing your 25 videos in our infrastructure. And so I think definitively yes. And I think the question is like, how large or little do we want that group to be? That probably changes over time. But in our current world, Harry, please stop. Please don't stop using Loom. And we'll also see how we can get you a paid plan.
Do you know what I use it for primarily? And this sounds awful. I use it for turning down founders, because I find emails very impersonal. And so when you say, Janie, I love meeting, I found these were my 3 core struggles that I couldn't get over, actually. And it's a much more human, nice way to actually make a hard decision and potentially let someone down. It was more contextual than email. And so I find it incredible for that.
I love that. I think the human nature and the empathy is massive. We also love using it for the opposite use case, which is when we send out offers to folks, we have everyone on the hiring panel record a loom, and we send them a doc that has 10, 15 embedded looms in the doc. And I remember being on the receiving end and feeling absolutely floored. It's one of those soft things that, sometimes actually help you tip the scale to choosing an offer that might not be as competitive from a financial perspective, but give you a real reason to join.
Okay, hard question. Loom is a PLG product. There's like a consumer adoption slant. Loom wanted to go into enterprise. Loom, I'm sure, wants to go into enterprise. It is a different product game. It is really hard to make that product transition. You suddenly have a different buy. You have the problem of agency. For you as the product leader, just talk to me about how you face that product challenge of building a consumer product. Oh shit, no wait, we need to do an enterprise product.
I think there are a few things. I think one, we have the big elephant in the room of, I think we're in a pretty competitive spot in that we've been acquired by Atlassian. And so I think that's one. I think point number 2 is you just have to fundamentally change the DNA and makeup of your team, both in how you hire, but also how you operate. Like a enterprise PM and enterprise team is not going to be seeing the immediate quarterly results or impact to the business that a core product or growth team is. And so how do you fundamentally change how they operate, what gets celebrated? And you need to create the space for that.
How do you change that? Like what changes?
I think from a celebrating the types of success, I think in core product growth, we're typically really, really oriented around, have you driven more engagement, usage, or revenue? And you can usually see that within a quarter. I think for enterprise, I think there are a few components to enterprise. I think there are just some table stakes things that are maybe unsexy to the average core product person, things like data residency or HIPAA or FINRA compliance that you're not actually going to see immediate dollars to, even if you spend 6-9 months building the thing. And that's because sales cycles are much longer. And so for something like that, how do you actually celebrate the top level of the inputs or the pipeline? It's, hey, by actually building out data residency, this is how much more opportunity or how much more of our customer base we've unlocked. In the next quarter, I think the results that we celebrate may not be purely owned by product teams. I love sharing core outcomes with my sales counterpart. After we build the thing, unlock the revenue, I actually want to see in the next quarter, like, how much have we actually been able to turn into pipeline? And that's the thing we celebrate. And I think as you think about these sales cycles being so long, you celebrate the input you can drive and you share those outcomes with the team that owns it. Because as you move into sales-led enterprise, I could build the best product in the world. and it might not result in revenue. And so I think like even my own success and I think ability to succeed and drive impact as a product person completely changes. And so that's kind of a big thing.
So I'm an angel investment of yours, and we've got a great PLG product, and I'm the CPO or the CEO, and we're going to move into enterprise because that's where we're being told we need to go. What advice would you give to me, knowing all that you know now, having made and being in that transition?
Yeah, I'd say two things. Just in having done both methods, I think one method is working your way up to enterprise. And then I think the second is like, if you are seeing enterprise demand kind of at the larger scale, what do you do? I think the first mistake we made a few years ago in trying to go after enterprise is not figuring out or learning how to win all the customers in between PLG and enterprise. And you talk to different people have different definitions for what constitutes an enterprise customer. But in peak COVID, we were, originally selling to small teams, and suddenly we had very large customers with C-suite execs freaking out about company culture or company productivity. And obviously we were excited that 10, 15,000, 20,000 employee companies wanted to buy us. And so we jumped straight in trying to build for these customers. And we never figured out our playbook for SMBs, mid-market, enterprise before then. And that made the jump really hard because obviously demand dried up. And when that happened, we built a bunch of features that like not a lot of companies or customers actually needed. And customers were no longer willing to buy wall to wall without that natural usage. And so I think it's really important to figure out your sales motions at SMB and mid-market because you're getting forced to learn, especially from a go-to-market perspective, like what to build, how to sell, how to create resonant messaging. And then I'd say, on the other hand, and things that we're kind of learning as we integrate with Atlassian is you're either in or you're not at some point in building for enterprise. I think the jump to go from PLG to enterprise is a pretty big one at some point, and you could progressively get there, over the course of years. But at some point, when you're talking with multiple big customers, they kind of need it all when it comes to the enterprise requirements. And what I mean by they kind of need it all is a lot of large customers may not need data residency, but they need XYZ. A different customer may not need XYZ, but they need a different permutation. And I think it becomes really, really painful for product teams to constantly figure out what is the next thing that we have to build to unlock this much more revenue. And instead, I think having the top-down commitment that like, hey, we want to win at enterprise. We're not going to iteratively get our way there over the course of 4 years. And at some point, I think the switch needs to turn on where as you're seeing more demand from these customers, you need to make a real commitment, both from a staffing perspective and on R&D as well as go-to-market, that you're really gonna win and go all in. I think at some point, after a certain amount of demand, you just need to get there and change the way you fundamentally operate.
What is the tipping point for when you will change product roadmap to gain a segment of revenue? So you have your product roadmap, and then deviated well away from it is another product requirement, but it unlocks 10 million in ARR from 2 or 3 large customers. When do you say, yes, we will deviate versus no, we won't?
There's the one-off feature answer of, hey, if certain things hit a certain revenue threshold, let's do it. And I'd say before a company makes a real commitment to enterprise, that's typically the way. It's, hey, create some revenue threshold. The actual number itself, I think, is less important and more relative to like what your business needs. And then I think at a larger scale, the broader commitment comes from PLG not going to be enough. And how do we kind of anticipate that? I think there's a really great article called The PLG Trap, that starts to outline like why PLG companies, to be truly enduring companies, need both PLG and sales-led. And I think the company needs to figure out at what point are they willing to invest to kind of go more full in relative to considering inbound requests at a customer and feature by feature level basis.
I spoke to so many of kind of our mutual friends, and they said that one of your great skills was writing. And I do just want to dig in on this because I think it's so core to the role of PM. What are your single biggest piece of advice to PMs on writing and written communication?
My biggest advice, and this is also very personal to me, is I think writing can be a very powerful tool to clarify your own thinking and thoughts. I think for me, the process in it of itself is the forcing function to develop really, really clear thought and do it at scale so that you don't need to be in every meeting to scale the context or the why or the how, especially in a hybrid world. And I think to get to really, really clear writing, I think it requires you and assumes that you understand things so well that you can explain them to other people quickly. And I think I really, really encourage all of our PMs to be writing things that requires a ton of detail, go there. But what is the 1 or 2 pager that everyone can read such that they know the what and the why and the how and know exactly what their job is and can create the enough context such that when they're making micro decisions in their everyday, you trust that they have the underlying context.
So I'm a PM and I'm not great at writing and I don't love writing. What would you advise me to get better at writing?
From a actual tactics perspective, I think it's not going to be fun, but it's to write more.
In what way? Like write PRDs more, write like updates for teams more? Like what should I write?
All of the above. I literally, for folks who on my team are trying to get better at writing, I kind of anchor on a few things as really, really tactical tips. I think there's the PRD aspect. It's much higher stakes and so requires a ton of revs, which is everything you need to do needs to be a great PRD. For someone who is not good at it, you need to get started earlier, get more revs in, and get the feedback before it's at a place where people are ready to consume. I think another easier day-to-day, lower stakes way to get better at writing is taking the mindset of how do I make every single meeting I have more effective by clear writing. And so from a pre-meeting perspective, it's, hey, like you should actually send out the goals and the agenda and the like desired outcomes of your meeting to everyone that is attending, like a day before the meeting. I think it requires you to clarify your own thoughts of what is the best possible outcome of this. And then do people know what they're expected to do as they get to the meeting? I think after meetings is also something that I encourage PMs to be great at, which is after the meeting happened, how do you distill the key takeaways and the summaries simply and the action items? And if you take one look at it, it might feel like a lot of program management, but I think on the other hand, it also feels like forcing great writing, which is distill the things that matter most, make sure people know what they are, and make sure they're communicated in a way that lands. And I think even the process of forcing people to think about something before like said event, forcing people to take said event or learnings, distill it down again, is just building that muscle of like distill, and repeat. Very, very specific tactic, but I think it's a lower stakes way to just force yourself to get better.
The more specific, the better. So never, ever worry about that. Can I ask you, what are the biggest mistakes that you see PMs make when it comes to writing?
I think people often share their writing before they get to distillation. And so I think people oftentimes mistake like volume of writing with depth of thought or clarity of thought. And you can get into a document, a strategy doc, or PRD beyond page 8 and still ask yourself, I don't know what I'm reading. There are a lot of details here. There are a lot of edge cases or requirements, but I still don't know what, why, and how. And so I think that's number one, which is especially for folks who are trying to get better. Before you think it's ready, you probably want to take 5 more revs at simplifying is the biggest one. I think the second one is not knowing who your audience is. Writing for an exec team to manage up is very different for writing for your engineering team who's going to take this and turn it into lines of code. And the level of context they need is very different, but also the language and the why is very, very different. And so I'd call out those two as the things that I see most often.
Totally agree with you there in terms of like the ICP of the content. I say with every piece of content that we do, like, who's the buyer?
Totally.
And that's really important because it also changes the positioning of every single question you ask. Like, why do I ask there about like what are the mistakes? Because I'm putting my hat on of like I'm an aspiring PM or I'm a product leader measuring the skills of a PM. So totally agree with you there. Another, I had so many like where they said Janie's great at this and I wanted to unpack it. Apparently you're amazing at question asking, which is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about being obviously an interviewer. What are your biggest lessons on what it takes to ask great questions?
I think for anything that is coming my way or to my desk, I have to be able to answer like some combination of these questions for myself. And if I can't, then that's when I ask a question. I think the first is just like, can I explain really simply like what it is we're doing and like why are we doing this? And am I convinced it's worthwhile? If not, like, let's not take this conversation any further. Like, we have to get to good resolution here. Otherwise, the solution, how we get there, the people you need to get there, they don't matter. And so I think that's my first level of like, am I convinced and like, can I explain it? If not, like, that's fine. You might have a great answer and I'm just not there yet and you need to explain it to me. Or maybe I'm there and we just haven't gotten to like the root cause of why. And then I think as we get to like more of the secondary, tertiary level of questions, I think it's like, can I for myself identify like the most important things that we need to answer or the biggest risks? If yes, like what is the relative cost of not answering those or like getting the answer wrong? And I think that will determine like how deep do I go? If it's really, really consequential, I'm going to keep digging in. If it's not consequential, I don't want to create more work for my team. And so I might still ask the question, but like how deep do I go is really, really dependent on like what is the risk of getting this wrong? And then I think the last thing that I ask for myself is like, is there any context that I uniquely have that this team needs, or like an area where I should need to be connecting dots? And so that like answering that question for myself might not result in a question, but I think like my job in a lot of meetings, if I'm speaking, is like ask the right questions that are most important or like share the context that people need so that they have a more foundational North Star or why of what they're doing, or even know where and who they need to be talking to. If I'm able to answer these questions for myself, I'm pretty silent. I don't want to dominate a conversation. And if I can't, I think it's critical that I ask these questions so that we don't, a month before launch realize like, all of these things aren't in place.
I have two lessons for me, which is like you have 2 to 5 minutes at the beginning of every meeting where you have the chance to set the tone of like vulnerability and openness. Like vulnerability generally breeds vulnerability. Actually, I'm struggling with X right now, Janie. I'd love to hear how you think about it. When you ask for advice from someone, it engenders a feeling that they're sharing and giving, and it makes them much more willing to open up in the future conversation. So I always do that in the first 2 to 5 minutes. And then I would also say the biggest mistake people make is they're not comfortable in silence. Sometimes you have to ask a question and let it sit and not continue, and like the magic will happen in the silence. And I find too many people aren't comfortable in silence when asking questions. Two big things for me.
Only in the silence do people finally say the things people won't say. And that's usually right when the good conversation starts. And so I agree completely.
Totally with you. The hard element is in interviewing and in hiring. And I am an angel investment of yours, okay? And I'm hiring a product team. How do you advise me, an early stage company, on how to structure my hiring process for product team and product people?
Yeah, I'd say twofold. And it really depends on, are you trying to hire someone more senior or more specialized or not?
You tell me. We're at $1 million in ARR. We've got some customers, but I'm not that late and I'm not that early.
I personally am a huge fan of junior PMs. I think we all know the rockstar PMs who are really earlier in their career, and I think they have a few key traits that I look for. I think one is just like incredibly high horsepower, both on the IQ and EQ front. I think the second is effort. Hungry people who are going to work hard naturally just have a much steeper slope because they're simply doing more in the same amount of time and getting all those reps in. And I think the last one is, are they coachable? Do they have the humility to know that they still have a ton to learn and are able to adapt? And I think a lot of times, like, junior folks are oftentimes the cheapest, but also like from a pure salary perspective, but also can be a huge force multiplier and just a large arbitrage opportunity. And I think if you, especially in earlier days, can hire for these like generalists who have these three traits, you can really train them to be effective PMs very quickly. I think it doesn't get you all the way there, but again, I think for earlier stage, like if you have someone who can spend the time with junior folks, I'm a huge fan.
What are the questions that we ask in every interview? What are the must-ask questions for product hires?
It depends on the stage. I think in those initial parts of the top of funnel, I'm trying to get a really good sense of like, what is your track record of impact? Like, how introspective are you? And like, is there alignment on the opportunity? And then I think as you get, and I'm happy to go into any specific questions I ask there. And then I think as you get closer to deciding if you want to hire a candidate, look for much higher signal on the ability to like tackle the problems that we're tackling.
On the track record of impact, like unpack that for me. What questions do we ask?
I think one is super straightforward, which is like, what is your background and what's your biggest professional accomplishment and why? And I dig way, way deep into how or what they did and why they consider that to be their professional biggest accomplishment.
What do you want to hear there and what do you not want to hear?
Talking less about the feature that you shipped, or even I think the first like good answer is, I shipped something that had this impact. I think a great answer tells me like, this is the problem the company or the product was facing. And like, this is why it was one of the most important things and critical to solve. This is how I went about figuring out that it needed to be solved, how it needed to be solved. Like, this was my role. This was like the process in which I solved it. And this is how it landed with customers. And like most often, if people really, really drove outcomes and like tackled something hard, they're not going to get it right the first time. And so talk to me about like reality versus plan and how you actually forced the reality to match up closer to plan. And I think someone who's really owned something end to end understands why they were doing what they were doing, and tying it back to the importance is really, really critical. And I've seen people do this exceptionally well, even if they're not working on the most important thing from a top 3 company priority perspective, right? Like billing folks or a lot of platform product managers have to sell the why and the importance of what they do. And I think exceptional ones can talk about how it ties to the business rather than just building for scale and things like infra. And so I love to dig deep. I can talk to a candidate for 20, 30 minutes just on this question alone and leave feeling pretty confident on whether or not I want to keep having the conversation.
What % of them impress you?
It depends on if I have proactive outreach or inbounds. I think proactive outreach, because I'm almost doing the back channeling up front, probably like 50, 75%. Inbounds, much, much lower, just because there's really only one filter that's happening through my recruiting partner.
Okay, so we're testing for harder skills. What do we do to test for harder skills? And do we do case studies? Do we do any material tests?
Love, I know it's controversial, a take home. And particularly before the super day. And I use the take home to, one, assess, should they come and meet the whole team? Very expensive use of team time and their time. And then 2, if they come to the team, to start to test out how they actually work with people. Are they actually able to interact with critical questions? Do you come off as defensive or curious when probed? And so taking a step back, take home, usually a very, very ambiguous problem that we like to give folks that are tied to the work they're going to do.
So you give them a Loom problem specifically?
Yep. And I say, hey, and we are like roughly in this stage of maturity for our Loom creator experience. Like, tell us what you would do to drive a step change improvement in getting more folks to create. Pretty broad. You can really take it in any way. And for me, I think it highlights a few hard skills. Like, one is just, can you add clarity of thought to a really ambiguous problem and clear structure that folks can be convinced by? I think the second thing I look for is real creativity. Can you teach me something new or make me think about something in a completely new way? And I think last one is high effort and preparation. I think like a good take home looks polished, like well organized, thorough, smart, and like reads really well. Great looks like you've actually gone so far as to like create mocks or tell me about competitors and have actually gone through and like maybe recorded looms of different competitors. And I think that level of effort and preparation are highly indicative of how someone will attack something, how quickly and how deeply they will attack it. Is it a big investment and a big ask from candidates? Absolutely, yes. I think I'm extremely cognizant and grateful for that. But I think if there's a job you absolutely want, you're going to put in the effort and preparation. And I actually want to see that and what that looks like, because I think it almost translates to, how are they going to be in their first 30 days? Are they going to spend their first 30 days meeting people, having one-on-ones, or are they going to spend their first 30 days like absorbing context, but also getting really, really, really deep in their understanding and actually come out of that 30 days with a point of view?
What % of people do you put in the process of taking a day of the team's time, doing the test, and then they don't get it?
Yeah. So you're asking how many people make it from take home to super day or super day to offer?
So what is super day?
Super day is when they're meeting everyone on the team and really that final round.
So basically we have first interview and like, yep, hey, you're good enough. And then we do the take home.
Yep.
And then the super day. Yep. What is the progression rate between each?
Again, I think it depends on type of candidate. If it's a really strategic outbound, pretty high. And then if it is inbound, I'd say most of the drop off happens before it even gets to me, which is my recruiter will parse out all the resumes. By the time it gets to me, I'd say between initial conversation to take home, probably like 25%.
What are the biggest reasons super days don't convert?
One thing that I love in our super day, outside of the typical one-on-ones you have with leadership, cross-functional partners, is actually a 45-minute hour deep dive on the take home itself. So everyone, it's a small group of people within Loom who show up. They've actually gone through your take home already, have watched a Loom, and just come prepared with a bunch of questions. And they're not meant to be trick questions. We treat them as we would in a product review, which is, hey, we have a bunch of questions. We want to learn more. Let's use the time to up-level like craft and quality of decisions. And I think the candidate's ability to interact with the team is really, really high signal. Like I said earlier, like when asked hard questions, are they curious or are they defensive? When are they open to being challenged? And like, when do they have really high conviction? Do they have any high conviction at all? And are willing to defend some of their points of view? Or are they willing to be open to others? And how do you actually just naturally work with other folks? I think this environment is pretty akin to what you would be doing in your day-to-day with the team. And so I think it's as close to like real life simulation as possible. And it's not a random case study. You've already taken the time to think through this. And so I think it also solves for the fact that like not everyone is good at a random case study on the spot. Like, how do you do when you've thought about something, put in the time, and are then being asked to really grapple with hard questions?
How quickly do you know when you've made a bad hire in product?
Probably within the first 2 to 3 months. I think it's a few things. I think one is ability to deliver real impact. And impact doesn't need to mean you moved a metric. It's like, is your team in a healthier spot? Did you drive clarity into a really ambiguous part of the strategy that we haven't had before? I think bad hires spend the first 3 months still onboarding and still getting an assessment or the lay of the land. And I think the time from content and information absorption into behavior and impact, 3 months is plenty of time to see that. And if they can't do it then, I don't think they have. I haven't seen yet someone who's able to do it in 6 months or 9 months if they weren't able to do it in that first 3 months.
Final one before we do a quick fire. It's just like product reviews are a core part of the role of a product leader. How do you do product reviews? How do you structure them? Who's invited? Who sets the agenda? Just help me understand that.
We have 2 types of product reviews that we have holds on the calendar for every week. One is an exec review and one is more of a casual product crit. The exec reviews are typically for products that are really high stakes because they're high cost, really strategic, one-way door type products where if we get it wrong, it's going to be really bad. And so for these reviews, other execs will at the beginning of the quarter say like, this product needs to go through the review cycle, or PMs can self-nominate. And I think there are different types of discussions that happen in these exec reviews based on the product lifecycle. If it's earlier on, it's problem definition. Like we're not looking at mocks. We're just saying, are we solving the right business and customer pain point? And you have to identify both. You have to identify what is the business outcome we're achieving and like, how are we making our customers' lives better? And then I think as products get more mature and are farther along in their life cycle, we start to get into solutions. And we have exec reviews on the solutions. Want the product teams to come to the table with a few options, but be really, really opinionated on which one they recommend. And then I think the last one is a bit more in the weeds on execution. So once the team has built out the solution, how do we gain confidence that this is going to land with customers and starts to bring in go to market and really talk about how we'll deliver this product. And we've evolved this process a ton. I think the few things that really have made this effective are the rituals we have, like before, after, and during the review itself.
What are those rituals?
Yeah, before a exec review, the product leader or the PM will send out a Loom pre-watch 24 hours ahead of the review. And the expectation is that before people come to this review, that everyone's watched the review, they've all dropped in feedback and questions already. And I think most important, the feedback that is inputted into this artifact is prioritized in a self-categorization way. And so I think one of my favorite sayings from someone I worked with at Opendoor is, questions are cheap, answers are expensive, and the exec review should not try to get through all questions.
But what does questions are cheap, answers are expensive mean in product?
Look, for anything that you're shipping, we can ask any question that we want and try to get more information, but there are going to be questions that are absolutely critical to answering such that we are building the right things for customers. There are things that are important to know and might change some decision making or execution. And then there are a lot of questions that are actually just curiosities. And I think you bring in more and more people, there are going to be many, many curiosities. And I think it's really important to identify, when asked a question, which one of these are they? And it should directly correlate with the amount of time I spend grappling with it, because the more time you spend answering questions, I think there are diminishing returns for sure. And it's time you're not spending in actually building the product.
It's interesting. One of my great friends is Gustav Soderstrom. He's the CPO at Spotify. And he said that talk is cheap. And so we should do more of it. And I agree. I disagree with him thoroughly.
Yeah.
But he's the CPO of Spotify, and he's much smarter and richer than me. And so clearly I maybe missed something. How do you feel when you hear that?
I agree. How expensive is it to actually do the cheap talk exploration, and when are you doing it? I think timing is really important. I think when you're at the beginning stages, all ideas, like, welcome, helpful. But as you get further and further along, I tend to agree you need to start prioritizing. And when you don't, then I think you actually are causing a ton of distractions. And so when in the process are you collecting this, and the types of questions that might be critical at the problem definition stage are no longer critical once you get to execution. And so I think it's when and why you're asking matter a ton, and you should welcome it, but context and timing matters a ton. And because we ask people to self-prioritize, we actually spend time discussing the things that matter. I think you can and the meeting itself, the full 45 minutes to an hour, is spent on just the P0s. Because we ask people to prioritize, it's probably been the biggest unlock, and also allows people to join the conversation. I think in previous worlds, it was really hard to open up meetings without sacrificing speed to make decisions. And when you force everyone to prioritize their questions, context, or thoughts, you're able to scale context much more quickly and still maintain the integrity of really focused discussions. And I think that, combined with, after these reviews, making sure that product folks are closing the loop to share and scale context, is the other important bit. We don't always make decisions that everyone loves coming out of these exec reviews, but it's really, really important for people to talk about what the decision was, why it was made, what are the known risks or cons to making this, and like why we made them anyway. And that's the only way you get to disagree and commit.
I do want to do a quick fire, so I'm going to pepper you with some questions,
okay,
and then you hit me with your immediate thoughts. This one's not on the sheet, but I'm just interested. What skill do you think is really important for product leaders that you don't think you have yet?
I think it's storytelling at scale. I think at every level of product management, you need to be a great storyteller, and audience and reach that you have changes at progressive parts of your career, but even at progressive parts of company growth and team growth. And so I think this is something that I'm just always working on, which is, this moment in time is distinctly different from even a quarter ago or 2 quarters ago. Like, the storytelling that I was doing to reach, 200 people at Loom is going to be very different than the storytelling I need now at Atlassian, where we have 10,000 employees, more than 16 products. Everyone has very, very different time zones and priorities. And so I think that's something I'm just constantly working on, is how do I tell a story at the various points in time of company and team growth.
How does AI change your role as a product leader?
One is the speed at which we develop. It is just crazy how fast the future has come. And so things that we thought we'd be shipping in 5 years, we're shipping in 6 months or a year.
What's that down to? Is that because of Copilot? Is that because of, why is that?
Yeah, I think a lot of these, especially in the video space, the models are getting really good and getting better quickly. And so we are constantly building with the assumption that the basic automation or AI we have today is going to be 100 times better. And how do we build an experience that just gets better over time and be high conviction and just build for that, and trust that technology is going to come not in a year, but in 3 months. So we actually need to start building for it, even if it hasn't arrived yet. And so I think that's one. We've pulled up a lot of big bets that we may have taken in a few years, but we can take it now. I think the second one is, in a way, it hasn't changed the way we build in a lot of ways, just because I think AI is a tool and it's not the end. And I think that's something that a lot of folks do get wrong, is like, how do I build AI is the question people are AI products that people are trying to ask. And I think the question should actually be like, how do I use AI to solve the customer problems I know about, like, better or faster? And so I think it also doesn't change the way in which we build, and it's important that it doesn't.
What was the most recent wow moment you had with a consumer product, and why was that a wow moment for you?
I recently went to Kindbody. It's a women's healthcare provider in the US, and it's not that new of a company, but it is one of the best healthcare experiences I've had, and also a mix of software, in-person services, and just, I think, pushing the boundaries on a really difficult industry to move. And I think after working in real estate, I have deep appreciation for that. And I think the things that I loved, walked in, physical space and services were unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And it mattered a lot in like how I felt. I walk into Kindbody, walls are neutral color, amazing furniture, like smells great. And when you're dealing with a healthcare experience, there's just like an immediate sense of like relief and calmness that comes in. And then I think in all of their services, they do an insane thing in healthcare, which is provide transparent pricing. And it's literally up front and center. And they tell you, if you want this service without insurance, it's going to cost this much. If you want this service, it's going to cost that much. And I think that just both engenders trust, but is something that I've never experienced before. And then I think the last bit is they use software to tie it all together. And so they have a health portal like most healthcare providers. I think the functionality is roughly the same, but they've nailed the user experience, which is ease of use and delightful. They also spend their time focusing on being interpretable. And so when I see a lab test and all the results, I don't usually know what most of the things mean, and they tell me. And I think the exciting bit is it's better than anything I've experienced. But yet, as a product person, I'm like, there's still so much room to grow this thing. And I think it gives me a glimpse of hope and excitement for this industry that's like extremely antiquated, and progressively it feels like it's getting worse. And so might not be the most innovative, groundbreaking thing, but you mix all of these things together and it's still the best experience I've had.
Final one. What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you started in product?
I think when I started in product, I underestimated the importance of go-to-market and storytelling when it comes to actually landing a product really well externally and with customers. I think you oftentimes think, if I solve the right problem, build it really well, the users will come. And like, yes, sometimes it does. But when you add incredible go-to-market brand storytelling, the compounding effect, I think, is something that I didn't fully appreciate until later in my career.
Janie, listen, I've gone completely off schedule for most of it, but I love a natural conversation. So thank you so much for moving with the very flexing schedule, and you've been fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks, Harry, for having me. This was an incredible chat.